That many. That just helps me calibrate tonight's content. How many of you know that the British Army came through Middletown after the Battle of Monmouth? And just about every hand goes up. Good, good. All right. Okay, so Tom did a great job introducing me. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this slide, but yes, I'm very happy to note that my new book officially comes out on July 7th, but I have advanced copies, and you all are the very first audience that I'll sell the book to. So that's kind of fun. Okay, we're going to talk about the British march through Middletown immediately after the Battle of Monmouth. And whoops, am I going the wrong way here? There we go. There we go. All right, let's assume that's the last time I do that tonight. So importantly, let's talk about size and population, because I think it's hard to really understand the revolutionary period until you start thinking about numbers of people, where they lived, what they did for a living. So Monmouth County, which included modern-day Ocean County, had a total population, if you look at the tax lists, about 12,000, but it would have been more than that because there were people who sort of fell through the cracks and don't appear on the tax lists. So if you include itinerant laborers, if you include sailors coming in and spending half the year or months in between voyages, probably 15,000 is a better estimate. But importantly, you could take the entire population of Monmouth County, send them to a New Jersey Devils hockey game, and they wouldn't sell out the arena. So think about that when you think about size. And then when we talk about the British Army coming through here after the Battle of Monmouth, you're talking about, again, ballpark, including camp followers and ne'er-do-wells and other people who are selling things to the British Army as they go through. You're talking about, depending on whose numbers you like, again, 12 to 15,000 people. So imagine this column coming up Kings Highway and on some of the lesser roads, a group of people who would have been about 5 times the size of the population of Middletown Township, which is Matawan all the way to Sandy Hook, and 5 times the size of that population, and roughly the size of the entire county's population. Monmouth County, just further context, what we're talking about here, was among the more diverse counties, certainly among the more diverse agrarian counties in the 13 colonies. We had 5 significant religious denominations. I kind of like to make the audience tell me what the 5 are, so call them out for me. I heard Episcopal or Anglican, good. Dutch Reformed, Baptist, Presbyterian, Quaker, those are the big 5. You also would have had just a scattering of a couple Catholics, a couple Jews, but those really are the 5 that the population was significantly attending church, those congregations. You had roughly 10% of the county was African American. And when we say African American, it's important to note that depending on whose numbers you like, how you want to estimate, almost half of those people were free. So there definitely was a slave population, but when we talk about African Americans generally, you also have to remember that there were a lot who were not enslaved. And agriculture was the path to accruing wealth in colonial America. If you and we had really good farmland here in Middletown, and the farmers in Middletown not only had good land, but they had good access to sell their wares in New York. So if you wanted to create wealth, agriculture was the way to do it, but there was also a secondary maritime economy. And because Middletown, you had such good access to the New York market, you also had people who owned boats and ferried goods from the farmers to New York and back. Monmouth County was not a Garden of Eden on the eve of the Civil War. There was actually a lot of agitation and tumult here from 1769 right up to the dawn of the Revolution. We had riots that closed down the courts. And the reason that they were rioting is because it was a period of tight money, and you had farmers who took out mortgages, and there wasn't enough currency because of the tight financial policy of the British government. There wasn't enough currency to pay off your debt. Even it was a quasi-barter economy. You might be getting, for your farm goods, you might get great eggs, you might get great textiles, you might get tea, but you weren't getting enough cash. And without enough cash, you are not paying down your mortgage. The courts are foreclosing on farmers, and the Monmouth Countyans react to that by rioting and closing down the courts. Because if the courts can't meet, you get to keep your farm a little longer. So we had the courts closed down in 1769 and 1770. We also had the Sons of Liberty. You all have heard of the Sons of Liberty? Basically, it was a club of sorts that coordinated a boycott against British goods, protested British policies through a boycott. And we had Sons of Liberty chapters right here in Middletown. Also a couple others in Monmouth County, but the one right here in Middletown has left a couple of records and great documents. And then as we get closer to the Revolution, 1774 into 1775, the Americans who hold missions in the royal government, the government under Governor William Franklin, they begin to lose power and authority, and committees rise up. Committees that are sometimes called committees of correspondence, sometimes called committees of observation. But the purpose of these committees is to coordinate dissent against British policies and to coordinate a nationwide boycott against British goods. And individuals who are seen carrying British goods, trading with British goods, are publicly advertised as enemies of American freedom. They are ostracized. They themselves become boycotted and sometimes get roughed up along the way. So we have all of this going on in Monmouth County on the eve of the war. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about Middletown as it looks as the Battle of Monmouth is being fought, or immediately before that. So first, Middletown Township in 1778 goes from Matawan Creek all the way to Sandy Hook. So we're talking about the entire Raritan Bayshore we call Middletown Township. Middletown is, while it does have a loyalist population, it's also true that Middletown, in proportion to the size of its population, raises more men for the Continental Army than any of the other Monmouth County townships, and a good deal more men proportionately than most of the state. So you have Middletown Patriots, or if we use the word that they used for themselves, they called themselves Whigs, because Whigs were the party of political reform in England. So they called themselves Whigs, but we'll use the word Patriots tonight. Middletown Patriots assemble and raise a company for the Continental Army in January 1776, and then again raised a company in early 1777. In addition, there's a period of time where after the British land, and by the way, the first Americans to see the enormous British Armada that comes in June 1776 are Middletown militia. The first Americans to see it, and they're pretty scared, by the way, because this is an enormous fleet with 25,000 men, and the Middletown militia facing Sandy Hook, which is occupied by the British Navy. The Middletown militia facing them is a couple hundred men, not enough weapons, no artillery, and they're seeing 25,000 British soldiers. Now they know pretty quickly that the British are heading for New York and not New Jersey, but there are letters generated at this time from Monmouth Countyans, including towners, basically saying, "Look, if the British turn their attention to us, we're done. We can't face this army." So this is a time of great fear, and Middletowners are very aware of their vulnerability. In late 1776, we have a period of time in which Washington's army has been defeated around New York and retreats all the way to Philadelphia. The British army comes into New Jersey and goes as far as Trenton. General Howe, commanding the British army, is worried about going all the way to Trenton. But he even writes in a letter, the chain I own is too extensive, meaning his list of posts going to Trenton. He knows that his troops in Trenton are vulnerable to counterattack, but he does it to cover, his word, to cover the loyalists of Monmouth County, who have a period of time, it lasts about a month, called the Tory Ascendancy, when the Continentals have retreated all the way to Pennsylvania. The loyalists in the state are emboldened and they rise up. And for about a month, there's a loyalist quasi-government over most of Monmouth County, including government led by the Taylor family of Middletown in the Middletown Township. There's another smaller ring of loyalists led by the Kearney family out of what would today be Matawan, Keyport. And we have Middletowners of ambiguous loyalty, and they were called the disaffecteds. The disaffecteds are people who stayed home and didn't pick up arms against the cause, didn't pick up arms against the revolution, but the moment they could, they were trading with the British because the British paid well. And while they were trading with the British, they might provide intelligence on where the militia was or where arms were being stored or other intelligence that was helpful to the British. So we have all of this going on. We have, as the Taylor family and the Grover family and some of the pre-war leading families are exposed as disaffected or loyalist, it opens up room in the leadership ranks for new leading families to emerge. So we have Schenks and Smocks and Motts and Vanderveers and other new families, mostly Dutch in Middletown, take leadership positions in local government. And then heading toward the Battle of Monmouth, a few months before, we have a raid, May 27, so a month before the Battle of Monmouth, we have a raid against Middletown Point, which is Matawan today, in which about half of the village is razed, and in which a number of militiamen are killed. And it really stokes the resentment, because up to this point there had been a lot of action, but few deaths. But here we have militiamen being killed by a superior British loyalist attack. Okay, now the Battle of Monmouth itself. Battle of Monmouth, a few things we should know is it occurs at a time where the British are going from offense to defense. From June 1776, when they land that massive fleet at Sandy Hook and proceed to New York, all the way through the capture of Philadelphia in late 1777, the British are continually on offense. They have a bigger, stronger army. They're pushing Washington's army around. Washington's army is smaller, less well-equipped, less well-trained, and the British win a string of military victories and even occupy Philadelphia, the capital, as well as New York. But that all changes in February 1778 because in February 1778, France enters the war. And even if not a single French soldier or ship ever came to America, it still fundamentally changed the American Revolution. And here's why. Because now war for the British isn't just a rebellion in America. Now war for the British includes fighting the French in the Caribbean, which is, if you're a colonial empire, where the big money is, because that's where the sugar is. Sugar is the #1 cash crop in rum, its outgrowth. So the British are now diverting resources to the Caribbean. They're keeping ships home to guard the English Channel from a French invasion, and they're fighting the French in India. And so the British pull resources out of America. We don't really talk about that a lot when we talk about the American Revolution. But the reality is, in 1778, America goes from being the most important military concern of the British to probably the third most or fourth most important. And the British are consolidating forces. So the British give up Philadelphia. They're not pushed out of Philadelphia. They give it up because they don't have enough troops to be garrisoning the two major cities of New York and Philly. They decide New York's an easier city to protect and to get supplies to and to communicate to. So they send some men by ship around the Delaware, down the Delaware River and up to New York, but the bulk of their army marches across New Jersey. And it's a miserable march. It's hot. And the British are encumbered by all of their plunder and all of their loyalists and all of their camp followers. And they're all in their heavy woolen winter coats. And they're marching across New Jersey. And everywhere they stop, they think they're going to get some water. The well is fouled. Every time there's a little brook, the bridge is taken out, and they have to stop for 6 hours to rebuild a bridge. When they send out little foraging parties to gather up either by purchase or by bayonet point to gather up forage or food for their horses and their men, if that party is not of sufficient strength, they're pot shots and they lose 3 or 4 men at numerous times in these little running actions that occur all across New Jersey. So this is a miserable, miserable march for the British. Depending on whose numbers you like, they lose 1,000, 1,300 men just to desertion. And we're not even talking about anyone getting wounded or sick, just deserters. They come and they decide to stop at Freehold on June 27. They stop to rest their men, but they pick Freehold for another reason. Anyone want to hazard a guess on why they decide to stop at Freehold? Freehold is full of, to use the word they used, the most obnoxious, that's the word they use, not my word, is full of the most obnoxious patriots. And if you're going to stop anywhere on the march to gather up supplies for your army, stop in the place where you don't mind taking their horses and cows, pigs and chickens, milk, whatever else you need. That's the place to do it. And while they're there, by the way, they burn about a dozen houses, just sort of senseless arsons. So they're mean to Freehold. And we'll talk about what happens in Middletown. But when we talk about what happens in Middletown, it's important to know that what went on in Freehold was a lot worse. And it was deliberate that they stopped in Freehold for that reason. But the delay in Freehold allows Washington, coming from Valley Forge, to get at least his advance guard under General Charles Lee and the Marquis de Lafayette, able to catch up with the British and engage the British just outside of Freehold. And that starts the Battle of Monmouth. And It's arguable that General Clinton of the British Army didn't especially want a major battle at Freehold. And depending on which historian's interpretation you like most, it's arguable that Washington didn't want a major engagement at Freehold either. But they got it. They both got it because the rear guard of the British Army hits against the advance guard of the Continental Army and turns the advance guard of the Continental Army. Washington arrives. He has a choice. He can accept a defeat and let his men flee back in disorder, or he can bring up his artillery and more of his best soldiers and try to stabilize the line. And that's exactly what he does. And it's successful. He stabilizes the line, and then the second half of the battle is an artillery duel, and Washington's men hold the higher ground. If you hold the higher ground in an artillery duel, you're probably going to prevail. And at sunset, the firing stops, and the British begin to move out of Freehold. So it's sometimes you'll hear, well, let's do a show of hands. Who thinks that the Battle of Monmouth? Who thinks the Americans? Who thinks the British won? Okay, only one hand for the British. So first, by the rules of warfare as understood in the 18th century, clearly the Continental Army won because they held the field. And that's how victory was assessed in formal European battlefield manuals. If you hold the field, you're the victor. The Continental Army held the field. Now, it's also true that why was Clinton moving across New Jersey? To get to Sandy Hook, to get to New York. So Clinton fights a rearguard action and then leaves and gets to Sandy Hook. So hit from a strategic vantage point, you could completely argue that the British won because their important strategic objective was achieved. So you could argue it either way, but what is important is how it was portrayed and how it impacted the American populace. And to the American populace, it was portrayed as a Continental Army victory. And so it was very important in that respect. Okay, so the British at Freehold, their baggage train had been trailing them, but now they move their baggage train in front of the army because Washington's now attacked them from behind. So the baggage train is where all the good stuff is. That's where all their fine fabrics are. That's where all of their liquor is, all the stuff that really matters. So that they move that to the front. And so when we talk now about the British coming through Middletown and eventually making it to Sandy Hook, imagine a scenario in which outside, there would have been some dragoons and some mounted troops in front of the baggage train, but the infantry is actually behind the baggage train. So if you're a Middletowner and you're seeing the column come into Middletown, the first thing you see are some mounted men, and they're coming through and raising a ruckus. But then you just see line after line after line of wagon. And only after the wagons do you start to see British infantry. All right, let's go. Whoops, did I? Okay, here we go. So the British baggage train was, the British line of march was about 12 miles. Most of that is baggage train. They were attacked as they withdrew from Freehold. They were attacked twice by Monmouth militia. They repulsed both attacks. That would have been probably, if you know about where Brookdale Community College is, those are more or less where those deflections would have occurred. the main body of the British Army leaves Freehold in the middle of the night, and you can see a German officer. And remember, 1/3 of the British Army at the Battle of Monmouth, a third, a third, and a third. A third of the British Army is German. A third of the British Army is American, loyalists. And a third of the British Army are redcoats from the British Army proper. So our column marched all night. At 5 o'clock in the morning, we halted 3 miles from Middletown, and the British enter Middletown on the 29th. Oh, thanks, Tom. Okay. Washington has a choice. Is he going to aggressively pursue the British Army or not? So he actually convenes a war council at Englishtown. And in addition to having a number of his generals with him, he also has a number of Monmouth County's most prominent patriots join him. And what he hears from those patriot advisors, Dr. Thomas Henderson, Colonel David Foreman, Lieutenant Colonel David Ray, consistently is, if you attack the British in Middletown, they will have the high ground. So Washington, who again maybe didn't really want the general engagement and the big bloody campaign right now, is the British are retreating, let them retreat. Washington decides not to aggressively pursue the British. He spends 2 days at Englishtown. One day is a day of celebration, and he creates sort of a hodgepodge force of militia and Continentals to shadow the British into Middletown. It's well understood they're heading to Sandy Hook, and just to shadow them and to limit the amount of plundering that might occur. Okay, so who are these Americans in the shadowing force? First, they are led by Colonel Daniel Morgan, a Virginian and someone who Washington trusts a great deal. And Morgan is one of the Continental Army's best battlefield officers. Washington orders Morgan, you will press upon their rear and pick up all that you possibly can. Why? Because they're stragglers of the British Army. There are deserters. There are people who fall behind for a variety of reasons, including the fact that they're sick, malnourished, heat stroke. Pick up those people. You will follow them as far as you can, consistent with the safety of your own party. So Washington is saying, press upon them, but don't press upon them so close that they might wheel around and attack you in a general engagement. So we've got Morgan's riflemen. We've got a cavalry regiment under Colonel Stephen Moylan. We have a number of, about half of the New Jersey Brigade under General Maxwell, and 1,000 New Jersey militia. Actually, collectively, that's not a bad-looking force. But here's the problem. Moylan's on a lark of his own and leaves Morgan. And we have a fascinating letter from Moylan on why he leaves Morgan. He leaves Morgan because his local guides, who have been from Middletown or Shrewsbury, tell him that there's a lot of stores gathered up for the British at Shrewsbury. So he goes off for Shrewsbury sort of to chase this gold mine that he thinks he's going to take for his men. Because if he goes there and there's a ton of stores gathered up for the British, that's a prize of war for Moylan and his men. So Moylan just sort of flakes out and heads toward Shrewsbury. Maxwell just doesn't march, and he's ordered to, but he doesn't. He stays in Englishtown. And the New Jersey militia um, begins to melt away. The men have fought at the Battle of Monmouth, fought well at the Battle of Monmouth, and fought all up to the Battle of Monmouth, shadowing the British and harassing them. And now that the battle's been fought, now that it's understood that the British are quitting New Jersey, these men just start going home. And General Philemon Dickinson, the head of the New Jersey militia, writes letters to Washington and Morgan apologizing that he can't keep his men together. But the militia just start to leave. Of course, the local militia, who are still dealing with the British on their home turf, the Monmouth militia stays in the field, but it's the militia from other counties that begin to flake out. Okay, the British camp. I'm sorry, Tom. Okay, maybe I'll just have you advance. I'll just nod to you. That we'll see if we can keep the slides up. Okay, the British camp at Middletown. First, an officer refers to Middletown as a little village surrounded by hills. Owing to the heat, it was almost impossible to breathe at Middletown. And wouldn't be specific to Middletown. This is what the weather is in New Jersey at this time. Clinton uses the house of John Taylor. John Taylor was the leader of the Middletown Loyalist insurrection a year and a half earlier. Other prominent Middletowners also have their homes used as headquarters by other British generals. And the British, while there, knowing that they're in a neighborhood where there are disaffecteds and probably some loyalists, but mostly a lot of disaffecteds, they put out a proclamation offering protection to any of the inhabitants who will not take up arms against them. So basically, you come into, I'm a British officer, I'm camped at the Patterson House, you bring me 2 cows and some other goods, and you express your interest in supporting the British cause. First of all, I pay you well for the agricultural goods that you bring me, and then I issue you a protection document saying that you are now under protection of the British Army. Now, of course, a few days later, when the British leave, that's not worth much, but they do give out these protections. As best I can tell from documentation, only one Middletown family chooses to pack up and go with the British at this time. There may be others, and it may be a gap in documentation, but in any event, not that many people choose to go. Okay, now we talked about what the British did in Freehold. There is mischief in Middletown, but it's not on the same scale. John Truax recalls that he was robbed by the British. John Tilton recalls that the family Bible was destroyed. By the way, why is destroying the family Bible a big deal? There you go. Everyone knows this. Yeah, a lot of genealogists here. Okay. Yeah, you all know. It's an insult because first of all, if you own any book, it's going to be the Bible. Books are expensive, but then it's the source of family information. And getting your Bible destroyed is an insult to the family. We have the Crawford home is looted of its valuable metals. We have a man who was forced to serve as a guide in order, basically he was extorted. If he wanted to save his horses, he had to serve as a guide to the British. We have a militia muster site, that's a barn, not a house, a barn, that's burned. And we have in nearby Shrewsbury Township, we have the capture of a man who did not sufficiently show fidelity to the British. And we also have a woman who is struck with a gun stock. So, I mean, there are incidents. And if we had perfect documentation, I'm sure there are more incidents than there are on this slide. But it's not the wholesale plunder and arson that we see in Freehold. Next slide, please. Okay, the Baptists. The Baptists enter the revolution with a split congregation. And they purge. In fact, the minister, Abel Morgan, uses the term a purging time to describe what they do in early 1777, when they basically kick out all of their loyalist members. Abel Morgan preaches on June 28th during the Battle of Monmouth, and the cannon rumble from Freehold is audible in the distance. A week later, he writes, with the British coming through, that he cannot hold a meeting because of the British putting all in confusion by their plundering and ravaging, which may be a little overcooked in its language. But again, there was more bad stuff going on than I'm able to document. A lot of the smaller stuff simply is not documented for the modern historian. And even 2 weeks later, on July 19th, he still can't hold his meeting. And then when he does finally hold a meeting, he holds it in a barn because the enemy had taken all of the seats out of the meeting house. Why would they take the seats out of the meeting house? Firewood. Yeah, who said firewood? There you go. It's great. Cut wood's just great to burn. A lot easier than clearing trees. And the meeting house doesn't open until the end of August. Okay, while all this is going on, even though Morgan's force turns out to be much smaller than Washington had imagined, there are still a lot of skirmishes between Morgan's parties and the rear of the British. So on July 1, we have a British Army officer complaining about Morgan's men hovering about us and firing popping shots at us. A German officer writes on the same day that a strong enemy corps appeared here from Middletown, sharp engagement, and we have deaths. 3 Jaegers, German soldiers, are killed, 5 more are wounded, and Morgan's men withdraw. The next day, another officer writes about being attacked unexpectedly by the enemy, and we have another German soldier being killed and 2 more captured. So there is action. Morgan is, throughout the war, Morgan is an energetic officer who pushes his men forward. Next slide, please. Okay. So we know about Morgan that he writes a letter. Remember, he's there to pick up stragglers. So he writes a letter on June 30th that he's taken 30 prisoners and 100 deserters. So he's picking up men. And remember, Morgan's regiment's about 300 men or so. So Morgan's doing a lot with 300 men. Morgan is augmented by Monmouth militia who are attaching themselves to Morgan. So Benjamin Wilson of Middletown participates in one of the skirmishes at Stout's Mill, where he claims 3 of the Hessians are killed. Another Monmouth militiaman writes about being near Middletown, where he suggests he killed 2 British soldiers with 1 shot. Maybe a little embellished. But in any event, that's the second part of his report that I particularly like. Why did they engage the British straggling party? Because they were robbing a farmhouse. The British don't want to stay in Middletown, so they keep moving. Their camp stretches east to the Highlands. Their encampment at the Highlands, there are a number of accounts about it. None of them are pleasant. So a German officer writes, camped in the woods near the Shrewsbury River, and then the Highlands. They quit. The rear of the British Army quits on July 2nd, goes to the Highlands. Morgan enters on July 2nd and notes that he and the British are in full view of each other. He takes 6 horses that are left in Middletown, but notes that these horses are worn out and are rather an encumbrance. can't even raise a gallop off them. Next slide. Okay, so the evacuation to Sandy Hook begins. Sandy Hook, by the way, right now is an island at this time. So the British have a problem. How do you march men across to an island? And they essentially create a bridge of boats. They line up boats horizontally across the body of water called the gut, and then they lay planks over the boats. So they create sort of a pontoon bridge. In fact, they call it a pontoon bridge of floating boats with planks across. And they start marching their men across. The body of water is called the gut. It is, by the way, in all likelihood, was fast flowing and dangerous. There are other incidents at other times in the war where people drown in the gut. And it's described as a narrow bridge of boats on which not more than 6 men abreast could pass. So if you can only march 6 men at abreast onto Sandy Hook, and you've got ballpark 12,000 men, that's going to take a while. The crossing onto the Hook takes 3 days, and the British, to prevent an attack, form a crescent around their the bridgehead so that it's guarded. Next slide. Okay. Just before I hit this slide, just there are a handful of accounts of that encampment on the Highlands, and one account talks about the soldiers had to send their tents ahead of them, so they had to sleep under cobbled together twigs for a couple nights in the rain. Another report is that they were bitten by so many mosquitoes that their faces were unrecognizable and their eyes were swelled shut. Again, maybe a little bit of embellishment. The people of this period wrote in such a way, but make no mistake, this was a miserable encampment for them. So Yorktown at Sandy Hook. What we know about Yorktown 3 years later is a British army marched onto a neck of land, and it couldn't get off of the neck of land because of a powerful Continental Army blocking it, and it couldn't escape through the water because of a powerful French Navy blocking it, and they were eventually pounded into submission until they surrendered. We almost had the same circumstance in July 1778, because there was a big French fleet that was looking to get to America and trap the British Army in the Delaware River before they could get out of Philadelphia. But they arrived too late, and the British got out of Philadelphia and got their fleet around the Delaware Bay and up to New York, but only by a few days. So the French arrive on July 9th in the Delaware Bay. They find out that they missed the British by a couple weeks, and they head north to Sandy Hook, where they arrive on July 11th. But imagine the British Army gets across to Sandy Hook and then ferries to New York on July 5th and 6th. Imagine if the French had gotten there on July 5th instead of July 11th. That would have been put the British in an extraordinarily difficult circumstance. But be that as it may, the British did get there. The timing didn't quite line up. The French fleet that arrives outguns the British by about 50%. It's also true that the French, when they do get there, bring on a lot of American pilots and start to figure out if they can cross Sandy Hook and engage the British in New York Harbor. D'Estaing, the admiral, wants a fight. He has superior firepower. He wants the fight, but his biggest ships sit 23 feet deep in the water. And his pilots are telling him that the channel into Sandy Hook is 22 feet. Now, could D'Estaing have unloaded his boats, gotten that and floating higher, and then cross into Sandy Hook? He absolutely could have done that. But then he loses his firepower advantage. So he can't cross Sandy Hook and engage the British in New York Harbor because his biggest ships are too deep in the water, and he could lighten them, but when he lightens them, now he loses his firepower advantage. So ultimately, the French stick around for about 2 weeks. They capture some British ships that are coming in and out of New York, but after they've just completed a transatlantic voyage. They need supplies. There is attempts made to resupply them through Shrewsbury Inlet, which you all know about Shrewsbury Inlet. Quick show of hands. Okay. The Shrewsbury and Navesink rivers, where you have roughly where Seabright is today, that would have been an opening into the ocean. And the continental government sets up a supply line to run through Shrewsbury Inlet, down Rumson Neck, through the Shrewsbury Inlet to supply the French. But it's only a trickle. The French need a lot more than the continental government is able to supply them. So the French get impatient and they just leave after 2 weeks and they go to Newport, Rhode Island. And they didn't check with the Americans about that. They just decided it was time to go. They needed to be in a true deep water port that could supply them better. Next slide. Okay, so after the march, the war doesn't end in Middletown when the British pull out. It enters a new phase. The British are no longer on offense. They, under Clinton, they kind of wall themselves up in New York. Now, they will eventually send troops to the South and fight a new kind of war in the South, but they stop playing offense in the North. And now they need that, but they still have 10,000 or so troops and all of these loyalist refugees. So they need continuous supplies. So they stoke the illegal trade, and they start winking at loyalist irregulars who basically rob and pillage to bring them stuff. And a lot of plundering, they use the word man stealing, kidnapping, goes on from American loyalists, embittered American loyalists. And the British kind of don't officially condone it, but they don't do anything to contain it either. And so irregular warfare, you've heard of Colonel Ty. Yes, most heads nod. Ty is probably the most effective of these irregular raiders, but Ty doesn't last that long. He starts in 1779. He dies in 1780. But there are a bunch of others. Ty, again, is probably the most effective, but there are a bunch of others, and there's a lot of activity. London trading, getting supplies to the British through disaffected Americans in small vessels at night is rampant. And a London trading incident gives us Holmes versus Walton. Show of hands, who knows Holmes versus Walton? Oh gosh, the hands don't go up. So this could be, if y'all will have me back again, this could be the next lecture. I love this. Okay, the Supreme Court. You mind if I go a little liberal artsy here? Okay, the Supreme Court. What is the most important power of the U.S. Supreme Court? It can basically tell the other branches that they're doing something that's unconstitutional. So the U.S. Supreme Court has that power because states in their own government had started to accrue that power for their own state Supreme Courts. So when the federal Constitution was written, they looked at what was happening in a lot of states and they said, oh, yeah, a Supreme Court should be able to do this. So the first case of a state Supreme Court finding a law unconstitutional has its roots in the London trade in Middletown Township. And what happened essentially, and I'll do the super duper quick. What happened was a couple of Middletowners acquired a large quantity of milk, and a group of patriots from Freehold, and there's a rivalry between Freehold and Middletown, come and they take it because you can't have silk unless you're trading illegally. Silk's going to come from the British. And they take it and they bring it to Freehold, where the Freehold magistrate, not the Middletown magistrate, says this is a valid seizure of British goods. Now, the problem is that the New Jersey Constitution says that you are guaranteed a right to a jury trial. And I'm really oversimplifying the narrative here, but that's the fight. And this goes before the New Jersey Supreme Court. And the New Jersey Supreme Court, looking at the text of the New Jersey Constitution, says, yeah, you can't do this. And overturns the law under which the Freehold magistrate conducted the seizure, upheld the seizure. So a little London trading incident in Middletown becomes the lever for the New Jersey Supreme Court to become the first state Supreme Court to strike down a law. And the most important power of the Supreme Court today in the Constitution is the sort of end product of a little contraband trading incident in Middletown. The later years of the war, the Whigs, the Patriots, split. And while they certainly don't like loyalists and they're fighting against loyalists, and occasionally British, but mostly against loyalists, they split themselves into two rival blocks. And I've written about this. You have the Machiavellians, who believe that the loyalist raiders are so evil that anything is justified if it punches back against an evil, evil enemy. And then you have a group who oppose them, who are the majority of Whigs in Middletown, who I call due process Whigs, who support the revolution, but do not but see limits on how aggressively they can pursue the war against the loyalists. And there's rivalries between them, and the rivalry comes to a head at the 1780 county election, where James Mott of Middletown is running to preserve his seat in the legislature, and David Foreman of Freehold brings a group of armed men with him and gives a speech against Mott, basically saying he's not really in favor of the revolution. He's weak, he's this, he's that. And then when Mott protests, beats Mott in front of the crowd. So while we think of the revolution as you've got British and loyalists on one side, you've got patriots on the other side, it's very important to recognize that this is a messy, messy time period, and you've even got patriots coming to blows with each other. After the war, a lot of the loyalists go to Canada, but a lot of loyalists want to come home. And the loyalists Many of the loyalists have had their estates confiscated, but even with that, a number of them try to come home anyway. And out of Middletown Township comes an association called the Association to Oppose the Return of Tories, which gains 250 Middletown signatures. And we don't have a lot of records on exactly what they did, but it was their purpose to make any returning loyalists feel unwelcome. And we know that there were vigilante incidents. Okay, so that takes us through tonight's prepared remarks. I love questions. Happy to chat with anyone. Yes. Uh, so it's, first of all, excellent question. It is Elijah Walton, who was a major in the militia at the time. It is not Asher Holmes. It is John Holmes, but I suspect he was in some way kin to Asher Holmes. I suspect. I'm not a Holmes family genealogist, but there's a very good chance that they were kin. Again, I defer to any Holmes family genealogists on this, though. Him there?
About the retrieval and appreciation, I've done a fair amount of research on it. I'm kind of came to the conclusion that it was Dutch Lane Road and Colts Neck Road into Laird Road into Red Hill Road and then up to Highway.
So,
right?
first of all, it's a good question. It's a hard question. Any one road would have been overwhelmed. So you have, when the British cross New Jersey, they're rarely in one neat formation. So I have absolutely heard and seen record, and there are people who study this, frankly, more than I have, about Dutch Lane. I absolutely have heard that. We know that they camp at Nut Swamp, which I think would be along that Dutch Lane route. I also assume that they came up the Burlington Path, Kings Highway. And the reason I assume that is because they have a lot of artillery. And you don't want to take all this artillery through narrow, unreliable roads. So, and we know that the Germans and the British regulars often take different routes. They come back together again, but they're very often in different routes. So I think you are right. I will tell you that I have not studied it extensively, but I think you're right. But I also think it would oversimplify things to say that there was one neat route on which all 12,000 men marched. I saw a hand here, and then I'll come back.
Exactly. Where British embarked on Sandy Hook said there was it might have actually been an island at that time, but where did they cross? Was it from Shrewsbury or was it islands? Did they row across the bay? How did they get to Sandy Hook?
Yeah, so my understanding based on the surviving documents, and by the way, there may be people in the room who, again, have done archaeological digs or other things that might give them knowledge over and above my knowledge. So I want to present this with some humbleness, but the gut is at the bottom of the Sandy Hook Peninsula, and it makes Sandy Hook an island. And the gut is dozens of yards wide. And it's probably pretty fast in at least part of it. They create a pontoon bridge, and I assume that the men are coming down from the Highlands area for the most part. Again, 12,000 men. They're in a lot of places, and now in terms of once they're on Sandy Hook, where do they embark to the ships? So about again, if there's Sandy Hook people who know the geography of the hook better than me, I'm happy for additional information. But as you go up Sandy Hook, there's an area on maps that's sometimes called Horseshoe Bay. And Horseshoe Bay is where the ships can come in a little closer. It's not a true deep water anchorage. The ships can't come right in. So we know that the men are wading out waist high into the water, hopping onto boats, and then getting ferried from the boats onto British ships. We have accounts of that. And I assume it's around Horseshoe Bay. But again, I don't want to suggest I have encyclopedic knowledge of some of these details of the geography of Sandy Hook because I don't. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, Thai. So what we know about Thai, and by the way, there's like a whole cottage industry on Thai now. It's really fascinating. So here's what I think we know about Thai. We believe that we know that a slave of the Corliss family of Shrewsbury Township named Titus ran away in 1775. We know that. Most historians, including me, think that that's probably Thai. Probably. We don't know for sure. Thai then disappears from the historical record for a little while. Some historians have suggested that he goes to Virginia and joins Governor Dunmore's Ethiopian Brigade. I doubt that. I don't know how you get as a runaway slave. I don't know how you get from Shrewsbury to the Tidewater area of Virginia and join an ill-fated military adventure. That seems unlikely. What I think is more likely is that Ty lays low for a while, probably in the swamps of New Jersey, where we know there are these sort of ungoverned areas where villains and ne'er-do-wells hang out. He probably engages in some loyalist partisan activity. He eventually finds his way to New York. We know that there are African American raiders in loyalist raiding parties, particularly in 1779. And he's probably interning under white loyalists in 1779. And then in 1780, there's a string of raids out of Sandy Hook along the Raritan Bay shore, where it's discussed in the newspaper accounts that the majority of the raiders are Black. And Ty's name doesn't show up in those initial raids, but it does show up in a handful of raids after those first couple. And the group picks up the moniker, the Black Brigade. And Ty, these are very successful raids. Ty carries off a legislator. He carries off Lieutenant Colonel John Smock, Captain Barnes Smock, other officers. He's good at his work. And these are very successful raids. Ty then tries his most ambitious raid. He goes as far as Colt's Neck in search of Joshua Huddy. And he brings off Huddy, who makes a spirited defense. And then his men plunder Huddy's house and tavern. And that's their mistake, because that takes a while. Plunder, it's hard to carry, ever try to catch a chicken? It takes a while. So those few hours of plundering Huddy, and then with a relatively large group weighed down by plunder, they do get to Rumson Neck, where they have boats waiting for them. But all this takes too long, and the militia engages them successfully. A bloody battle on the beach. Huddy is put on one of their boats, but then jumps in the water, gets shot in the thigh, friendly fire, it's a mess, and swims to shore shouting, "I am Huddy, I am Huddy. Don't shoot at me, I'm one of you." Ty, during that skirmish battle, whatever term you choose to use, gets shot in the wrist and he dies shortly after that. And there's a hand here. Okay.
Go back on a little bit. What were they after? How did they function?
Yeah, Middletown and the Patriots of the Raritan Bay were enthusiastic privateers, and they tended to go in small boats. That often whaleboats. A whaleboat is a large rowboat, usually pointed on both ends, often with a small mast. Crews commonly 16 men, usually a small cannon on the bow called a swivel gun. And the whaleboat privateers have incredible success. These are daring, swashbuckling guys. They attack at night. They will come up on larger vessels, grapple to the larger vessel in the middle of the night, jump men onto the deck, and 16 armed men, even if the other vessel might have a larger crew, if you have the element of surprise, you can take those vessels. And Middletown Point is a common place for these whaleboats to leave from. There are also whaleboats coming down the Raritan River from New Brunswick. But these whaleboat privateers, William Mariner, Adam Hyler most famously, have dozens of successful attacks on British shipping in the Raritan Bay. Dozens.
Navy allowed to come through.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? Yes, generally trading vessels. In a whaleboat, you don't want to mess with a British warship. It won't turn out well. Generally they're attacking commerce. I'll take one more question, and then I'm happy, by the way, I have books. I'll stay as long as y'all stay. And I'll take questions after. I did see a very patient gentleman back with his hand up.
I want clarification on the factual, and that was, at least something in your book about that Sandy Hook was the last place the British were, and then they completely left, their course left, right? And was that also, it was the first place they showed up?
So I think you could make, these are questions of definition. So you could say the British held Fort Duquesne, Pittsburgh, longer than they held Sandy Hook, and that's true. But along the Atlantic seaboard, the British held Sandy Hook longer than any other piece of the Atlantic seaboard in the 13 colonies. They took Sandy Hook in April 1776, and we don't know with 100% certainty when they left Sandy Hook. At least I haven't seen the document, but we do know that they were on Sandy Hook as late as January 1784. And so that is longer than any other piece of the seaboard of the rebelling colonies. Okay, thank you all very, very much.